Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. The reality is that Afghanistan is still in war. The infrastructure of the country is destroyed. Hundreds of thousands, and by some estimates, millions of lives have been killed. Many more have been wounded and disabled, and many more have been displaced in the country or become refugees. The reality is that conflict has turned Afghanistan into a breeding ground for fundamentalist and extremist groups and a battleground for regional and international powers. The reality is that there are no discussions concerning justice and accountability as part of the United States negotiations with the Taliban. The reality is that in over 40 years of conflict and violence, none of the major leaders of international crimes have ever been investigated or brought to justice. The reality is that despite the justice initiatives mentioned by the representatives for the Afghan government, only a handful of low-level perpetrators have been prosecuted, the War Crimes Unit is largely defunct, and perpetrators continue to operate with near impunity in Afghanistan. The reality is that peace first, then justice, has been a promise told to Afghan victims for the past 40 years and has resulted in neither peace nor justice. Your Honors, when considering the current situation in Afghanistan, it is inconceivable that an investigation into these atrocities would not be in the interests of justice. Pretrial Chamber 2 drew the opposite conclusion by contorting the notion of justice and speculating on what Afghan victims want. And in doing so, the pretrial chamber not only erred as a matter of law and fact, it abandoned the court's mandate towards the Afghan people. And we ask that this court not make the same mistake. Today, Your Honors, I intend to address how the pretrial chamber erred by 1, misunderstanding what victims want, 2, misconstruing the notion of justice, especially in the context of Afghanistan. And finally, I will comment on the government's position and why you should not allow it to prevent the opening of an investigation. As I explained on Wednesday, the pretrial chamber failed to effectively ensure victim representation. But beyond that, the chamber also failed to sincerely and genuinely consider the opinion of Afghan victims who did make representations. Fundamentally, Your Honors, the pretrial chamber presumed that victims would be against an ICC investigation due to its belief that an investigation was unlikely to result in the arrest and prosecution of a suspect. In the chamber's own words, and I quote, "Victims' wishes and aspirations that justice be done would result in creating frustration and possibly hostility vis-a-vis the court," end quote. That's paragraph 96 of their judgment. This passage is uncited, this passage is unreasoned, and this passage amounts to pure speculation. At no point during the victims' representation process were victims ever asked whether they would support an investigation absent high chances of success. And you can see that as a matter of fact in the victim representation form, which we have provided you in tab 2 of your binders. Rather, victims were simply asked whether they would, quote, "want the ICC prosecutor to investigate the violence associated with the conflict in Afghanistan since May 2003, end quote. And to that question, 680 of the 695 respondents said yes. There is no doubt that had the pretrial chamber genuinely asked Afghan victims of war whether they would support an investigation, even in the absence of high chances of arrest and prosecution, that the resounding response would have been yes. And that fact, Your Honors, is evidenced in the declarations we have provided you and which are referenced on pages 17 to 20 of our table of authorities. For instance, one civil society leader in Afghanistan explained that he spoke with over 700 Afghan victims and that, and I quote, Every person I spoke with supported an ICC investigation. They supported an ICC investigation even if the prospects of an arrest were low, end quote. And Your Honors, that's tab 6, paragraphs 9 to 10. Nothing in the record justified the pretrial chamber's speculative assertion that victims would not want an investigation under the circumstances. The record, and indeed the evidence, points firmly to the contrary. This leads me to my next point. The pretrial chamber also erred in its understanding of justice under Article 53(1)(c). Your Honors, my colleagues have very forcefully and very eloquently explained why the notion of justice under Article 53 is broader than effective investigations and subsequent prosecution of cases. So I'll instead focus on how Afghan victims believe that justice includes other dimensions, including truth, public accountability, and reversing a culture of impunity. And for this, again, I draw your attention to the declarations we have submitted to you by former high-level government officials and civil society leaders who collectively have interacted with hundreds of thousands of Afghan war crime victims. These individuals, Your Honors, as you can see for yourselves, uniformly share the conclusion that Afghan victims believe that an investigation would serve the interests of justice even in the absence of arrests and prosecutions. As noted by one former government official and civil society leader, he and his team spoke to and heard from thousands of Afghan victims of war with regards to the importance of an international investigation into crimes committed in Afghanistan. In his own words, and I quote, "Uniformly, Afghan victims of war support an ICC investigation into crimes committed in Afghanistan," end quote. And among the reasons for that support, he cites that the Afghan judicial system is still developing, and Afghan victims see, quote, "the ICC as an objective, unbiased forum for justice," end quote. And he notes that, and I quote again, "Afghan victims don't anticipate the ICC would solve all their problems, but they do see the ICC as a mechanism that would work on the issue of actually addressing war crimes," end quote. Your Honors, that's in tab 3 of your binders. Likewise, all of the over 100 individuals surveyed by NGOs on the ground about the pretrial chamber's decision conveyed that they would support an investigation even absent arrest and prosecution. And while the reasons they gave were varied, I wish to take this time just to highlight a few. One female victim who had lost her son in a truck bombing by a terrorist group in 2017 told us, and I quote, "I want war crimes to be investigated, and it is worth even temporary chaos and bringing peace and security," end quote. Her case, Your Honors, was never investigated. Another mother who lost her son in the same bombing in 2017 told us, and I quote, "Justice means a peace where no mother ever loses a child," end quote. Her case was never investigated. Another woman who lost her daughter after an attack on the Afghan Supreme Court by the Taliban in 2017 told us, and I quote, "An investigation will show people that their sacrifices are considered and not forgotten," end quote. Her case was never investigated. And finally, Your Honors, another victim told us, and I quote, "We can't bring back our dead. We can't regain what we have lost, but we can raise our voices and preserve the truth so people don't suffer the same in the future. And maybe we can gain some peace from being heard and acknowledged," end quote. Your Honors, her case was also never investigated. Overall, the reasons provided in our confidential declarations for why an investigation would serve the interests of justice are many. But at its heart, they concern the reality that Afghanistan has suffered 40 years of active combat. Who did what and when is unclear. Perpetrators continue to hold high social and governmental positions. Amnesty deals are an unfortunate reality, and people of Afghanistan yearn for a neutral, independent investigation. They reflect the hope of victims to have their suffering be acknowledged so that the record may be set straight, that perpetrators may be named and shamed, and that a fuller accounting of what has happened in Afghanistan can be brought to light, and so that a culture of accountability can be cultivated. Your Honors, no one is more sophisticated about the realities of how difficult it will be for individuals to be arrested and prosecuted than Afghan victims themselves. They are the ones who have lived for 4 decades and have watched amnesty deal after amnesty deal. They know that an arrest and prosecution will be difficult. But they also know that no action by the only court with jurisdiction other than the Afghan national courts will mean even more impunity, where Afghans will continue to be victimized, abused, and killed. And this takes me to my last point. The representatives from the Afghan government suggest that the ICC not investigate, watch what happens, and then decide later if it should intervene. We propose the inverse. This court should immediately authorize an investigation. The Afghan government can identify the specific cases it wishes to challenge under the statute's admissibility provisions, and the court can strike from the prosecution's investigation those cases that are being genuinely and appropriately pursued. As it stands right now, however, there is no reason to wait. While the government has recently made legal reforms, the written law unenforced is of little practical consequence to Afghan victims who have been suffering for decades and suffer to this day. Your Honors, we have provided you a declaration by a rule of law expert who specifically focused on precisely the justice sector reforms identified by the government's representatives in their submissions. That's in tab 5 of your binders. She researched the Attorney General's War Crimes Unit, and she concluded that the office is staffed with, and I quote for you, new graduates who lack experience investigating or prosecuting war crimes, end quote. She was also informed that a United Nations project to help with capacity building of that very office had been canceled, and that when she had asked why, she was told, and I quote, that it was no longer a funding priority, end quote. That's tab 5, paragraph 6 to 7. Her statement, Your Honors, was from July of this year. We have also provided you declarations from former high-ranking Afghan government officials who held their respective positions in the past 5 years. That's tabs 3 and 4 of your binders. You know who they are. You see who they are. You see their seniority. You can see how they were focused specifically on the justice sector and are intimately aware of how the judiciary works. Both concluded that the Afghan government is not capable of effectively prosecuting these crimes and that the ICC should open an investigation. Let me quote from them, Your Honors. One states...
Excuse me, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you very much. One states in his September 2019 statement that, and I quote, the Afghan justice system is improving, but it is still very weak, and they don't have the capacity to undertake the types of investigations the ICC is capable of. The system is also susceptible to interference by the Afghan government, the Taliban, or outside forces, meaning that justice will not be delivered in an unbiased or objective manner, end quote. Let me quote from another former government official from his statement just last month, quote, for 4 decades, every sitting Afghan government has failed to provide justice for Afghan victims of war. None of the government investigations have produced any viable and reliable results. The Afghan government will not be able to bring any measure of justice for the Afghan people anytime soon. The country is still existing in a political dust storm. If left to the authorities alone, the human rights violators and murderers will long be dead by the time the crimes are addressed, and their victims will have lost their chance at justice, end quote. Finally, you have the statements of civil society leaders who have interacted with tens of thousands of Afghan war victims. All of them tell you that the government is not able to effectively prosecute these crimes for a variety of reasons, not including the government's strength vis-a-vis various armed groups and other interested states. Your Honors, to conclude, the Afghan people are strong and they will persevere, but part of their path intertwines with this court. They are in this moment turning to you to provide a path that includes justice and accountability. We ask you to not sacrifice this court's mandate for politics. We ask you to not sacrifice the hopes of Afghan victims for political expediency. This concludes our submissions. We thank you for your time.